Long ago, in an age of heroes, a mighty war raged that would be remembered for thousands of years to come. The clash between Greeks and Trojans has become legend, passing from generation to generation through whispered tales and epic poems that still stir the heart today. Was Troy real? The remains of an ancient city still stand on the western shores of Turkey, its walls once tall and proud, now crumbled by the hands of time and conquest. Within those walls, over 3,000 years ago, a story unfolded that would captivate the imagination of humanity forever. The tales of gods and warriors, of love and vengeance, reached us through the songs of ancient poets who preserved these memories in verse. Greatest among them was Homer, whose Iliad and Odyssey painted vivid pictures of golden, armored heroes and divine beings who shaped the fates of mortals with their whims and passions. Before these stories were ever written down, they lived on the lips of bards who sang them by firelight, entrancing listeners with adventures both wondrous and terrible. Picture a world where gods descended from Mount Olympus to walk among men, where their jealousies and desires could reshape entire kingdoms. A world where honor meant more than life itself, where glory in battle was the highest pursuit, and where a single stolen bride could launch 1,000 ships across the wine, dark sea. This was the world of the Trojan War, a realm where divine will and human passion collided with devastating consequences. The story pulses with every shade of human emotion, passionate love and bitter hatred, towering pride and crushing grief, blinding rage and tender mercy. For 10 long years, the greatest warriors of an age clashed beneath the walls of Troy, their deeds echoing through eternity. Wise Odysseus, with his clever schemes and silver tongue, could outwit gods themselves. Achilles, whose wrath was as legendary as his prowess in battle, moved like lightning across the battlefield. Noble Hector, defender of his ancestral city, stood as Troy's greatest hope against the Greek onslaught. And Helen, whose beauty was said to rival the goddesses themselves, became both the prize and the curse that drove men to madness. Their names have echoed down the corridors of time, remembered when countless kings and kingdoms have been forgotten. The reverberations of this war never truly faded, creating ripples that continue to shape our understanding of heroism, honor, and human nature. The stories born from it have been retold and reimagined countless times, inspiring everything from ancient Greek tragedies to modern films and novels. They ask timeless questions about fate and free will, about the terrible price of honor, about what it truly means to be a hero in a world governed by forces beyond mortal control. In many ways, the story of Troy marks the beginning of Western literature itself, establishing themes and archetypes that writers still explore today. Our tale does not begin with the thunderous clash of bronze weapons or the screams of dying men echoing across blood-soaked plains. Instead, it starts with a celebration, a divine wedding feast that would plant the seeds of conflict and tragedy in the most unexpected way. Join me now as we travel back to that fateful day when the mortal king Peleus wed the sea nymph Thetis, and the first threads of Troy's destiny began to unravel. The palace of King Peleus gleamed with golden light on his wedding day, its marble columns adorned with garlands of flowers that perfumed the air. The mortal king had won the heart of Thetis, a silver-footed sea nymph of extraordinary beauty, whose grace could calm the wildest storms. Not since the earliest days of creation had there been such a union between mortal and immortal, a match that defied the natural order of things. The gods themselves descended from their mountaintop palaces to attend the celebration, bearing gifts and blessings for the unlikely couple. Zeus, Lord of Thunder and King of the gods, reclined at the head table, his presence filling the hall with divine authority. Beside him sat his wife Hera, Queen of Heaven, resplendent in her finery and radiating the majesty befitting her station. Poseidon, master of the seas and earthquakes, brought treasures from the ocean depths, pearls that glowed with inner light and coral carved by the hands of sea nymphs. Apollo strummed his golden lyre, filling the hall with music sweeter than mortal ears had ever heard, melodies that seemed to capture the very essence of joy. Dionysus ensured the wine flowed freely, the divine vintage bringing laughter and merriment to gods and mortals alike. Athena watched the proceedings with her keen gray eyes, ever vigilant and wise, noting every detail of the grand celebration. All the Olympians had come to witness this historic union, all save one whose absence would prove more significant than anyone could imagine. Eris, goddess of discord and strife, had received no invitation to this glorious celebration. Perhaps Peleus feared her presence would cast a shadow over the joyous occasion, knowing her reputation for sowing chaos wherever she went. Or perhaps it was a simple oversight, the kind of mistake that mortals make when planning events beyond their usual scope. Whatever the reason, Eris learned of her exclusion, and her heart burned with bitter resentment that would soon consume far more than just her own pride. If she could not share in the celebration, she would ensure the revelers remembered her nonetheless, and her revenge would echo through the ages. As the feast reached its height with gods and mortals alike losing themselves in wine and merriment, the laughter suddenly died. A golden apple rolled across the banquet table, its appearance so unexpected that conversations halted mid-sentence. The fruit gleamed impossibly bright, catching every eye in the hall with its supernatural radiance, as if it contained the very essence of beauty itself. Upon its lustrous skin, 3 words had been inscribed in letters that seemed to burn with inner fire: for the fairest. The celebration faltered as 3 goddesses rose from their seats simultaneously, each convinced the apple was meant for her alone. Hera, the proud queen of the gods, whose regal bearing commanded respect from all who beheld her. Athena, the wise goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, whose intelligence was matched only by her fierce pride. And Aphrodite, whose beauty was unmatched throughout creation, born from sea foam and blessed with power over love itself. Each believed herself the rightful recipient of this golden prize, and their rivalry would soon tear the very fabric of the divine order apart. The seeds of the greatest war in human history had been planted in that moment of divine vanity, though none could yet foresee the terrible harvest that would follow. When Paris arrived at the court of Sparta, with his retinue of Trojan nobles, he was received with all the honors due to a foreign prince. King Menelaus welcomed him warmly, for the Greeks valued the bonds of hospitality above almost all other virtues. The palace of Sparta was renowned for its beauty, but nothing could have prepared Paris for his first glimpse of Helen herself. She entered the great hall like dawn breaking over the mountains, her beauty so radiant that even hardened warriors fell silent at the sight of her. Her hair gleamed like spun gold, her eyes held the depth of summer seas, and when she moved, it was with the grace of a goddess walking among mortals. Paris felt his heart stop, knowing that Aphrodite had spoken truly when she promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Helen, for her part, found herself strangely drawn to this handsome prince from distant Troy. There was something in his eyes, a longing that spoke to something deep within her own soul, though she could not name what it was. The goddess of love was already weaving her spell, making both hearts burn with desire that would soon consume kingdoms. For days, Paris remained as a guest in Sparta, and each day the attraction between him and Helen grew stronger. They walked together in the palace gardens, spoke of poetry and music, and found in each other a kindred spirit that neither had known they were seeking. Menelaus, trusting in the sacred laws of hospitality and seeing no threat in the cultured young prince, even left Sparta on urgent business in Crete, asking Paris to remain as his honored guest. This was the moment Aphrodite had orchestrated, when opportunity and desire would finally converge. On a night when the moon was dark and the palace guards dozed at their posts, Paris made his fateful choice. Some say Helen went willingly, swept away by a love too powerful to resist, while others claim she was taken by force while she slept. The truth perhaps lies somewhere between these accounts, for the power of Aphrodite could make even the most virtuous heart forget its duties. What is certain is that when dawn broke over Sparta, both Helen and Paris were gone, along with several ships from the harbor and a considerable portion of the royal treasury. They sailed swiftly across the wine, dark sea toward Troy, their hearts full of passion but blind to the terrible consequences of their actions. Behind them, they left a kingdom in uproar and a king whose rage would soon shake the very foundations of the ancient world. When Menelaus returned from Crete to find his wife gone and his hospitality betrayed, his fury was terrible to behold. He called upon all the gods to witness his shame and swore by the sacred oaths that bound the Greek kings that Paris would pay for his treachery. But Menelaus was not content to seek vengeance alone, for he remembered the oath sworn by Helen's former suitors years before. Every great king and prince of Greece was bound by sacred vows to defend Helen's marriage and to punish any who would violate it. Now the time had come to call in that debt, and Menelaus sent messengers racing to every corner of the Greek world. The response to Menelaus's call was swift and overwhelming, for the honor of Greece itself had been challenged by this Trojan prince. From Mycenae came Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother, who saw in this crisis an opportunity to lead the greatest military expedition in history. His ambition burned as bright as his brother's rage, and he quickly assumed leadership of what would become a massive coalition. From Pylos came old Nestor, wisest of the Greek kings, whose counsel had guided 2 generations of warriors. From Salamis sailed Ajax the Great, a giant of a man whose strength in battle was legendary even among heroes. Diomedes of Argos brought his fierce warriors, eager for the glory that such a war would bring. From Ithaca came Odysseus, though he was reluctant to leave his beloved wife Penelope and infant son Telemachus. The clever king had even feigned madness when the recruiters came, plowing his fields with salt and yoking an ox and donkey together. But when they placed his baby son in front of his plow, Odysseus swerved to avoid harming the child, revealing his sanity and sealing his fate. Most reluctant of all was Achilles, the greatest warrior of his generation, whose mother Thetis knew that if he sailed to Troy, he would win eternal glory but never return home. She had hidden him among the daughters of King Lycomedes, disguised as a maiden, but Odysseus discovered him by presenting gifts to the young women. While the girls chose jewelry and fine fabrics, Achilles instinctively reached for the sword and spear hidden among the offerings. Thus was the greatest of all Greek heroes bound to the expedition that would make his name immortal. The gathering of the Greek fleet at the port of Aulis was a sight that would never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. Over 1,000 ships filled the harbor, their black hulls riding at anchor like a forest of sea, wolves ready to hunt. From every corner of Greece they came, bringing with them the finest warriors their lands could produce. The beach rang with the sound of bronze weapons being sharpened, the creak of leather armor being fitted, and the songs of bards celebrating the heroes who would sail to war. Yet for all their eagerness, the fleet was trapped at Aulis by contrary winds that refused to change no matter how many sacrifices were offered to the gods. The seer couches revealed the terrible truth. Artemis, goddess of the hunt, demanded a price for the fleet's passage. Agamemnon had boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself, and now she would have her revenge. The winds would not change until Agamemnon sacrificed what he loved most, his daughter Iphigenia. The king faced an impossible choice between his child and his ambition, between his love as a father and his duty as a leader. In the end, ambition won, though the cost would haunt him for the rest of his days. Iphigenia was brought to Aulis under the pretense that she would marry Achilles, but instead she was led to the altar of sacrifice. Some say that Artemis, moved by pity, spirited the girl away at the last moment, leaving a deer in her place, but the grief of her parents was real enough. As Iphigenia's blood stained the altar, the winds finally changed, and the greatest fleet in history set sail for the shores of Troy. Behind them lay the familiar coasts of Greece. Ahead lay 10 years of war that would test every hero's courage and claim the lives of countless brave men. The die had been cast, and there could be no turning back from the destiny that awaited them all beneath the walls of Troy. The Greek ships appeared on the horizon like a forest of masts, their bronze, tipped prows cutting through the morning mist as they approached the Trojan coast. From the walls of Troy, sentries counted sail after sail until the numbers became meaningless. The greatest armada ever assembled in the ancient world had arrived, carrying with it the fury of betrayed kings and the weight of sacred oaths. But the Trojans were not unprepared. King Priam had used the months since Paris's return to strengthen his city's defenses and rally his allies from across Asia Minor. The walls of Troy, built by the gods themselves according to legend, rose 60 feet above the plain, their massive stones fitted so perfectly that not even a blade could slip between them. Behind these walls, the greatest city of the east prepared for siege. The initial Greek assault came at dawn, as Achilles led his Myrmidons in a charge up the beach while the main force disembarked under cover of their shields. The Trojans met them at the water's edge. Determined to drive the invaders back into the sea, before they could establish a foothold on Asian soil. The clash of bronze on bronze rang across the coastal plain as the two greatest military forces of the age met in their first deadly encounter. Hector himself led the Trojan charge, his armor gleaming like fire in the morning sun as he cut through the Greek ranks with devastating efficiency. For a moment, it seemed the Trojans might succeed in their desperate gambit to end the war before it truly began. But Achilles answered Hector's challenge with a fury that bordered on divine madness, his spear finding gap after gap in the Trojan line until the defenders began to fall back toward their city walls. By midday, the Greeks had secured their beachhead and begun the methodical work of establishing their camp. They dragged their black ships up onto the sand and began construction of a fortified position that would serve as their base for what everyone now realized would be a long campaign. The Trojan cavalry harassed their work parties throughout the afternoon, but the damage was done. The Greeks had come to stay. Before the real bloodshed began, there was one final attempt at peace. Menelaus and Odysseus sailed under a flag of truce to Troy itself, demanding the return of Helen and the stolen treasure. King Priam received them in his great hall, where Helen herself sat beside Paris, her beauty still capable of stopping conversations and causing even hardened warriors to stare in wonder. Menelaus spoke with the controlled fury of a wronged husband, his voice echoing off the marble columns as he demanded satisfaction for the insult to Greek honor. Paris, young and arrogant, refused to even consider returning his prize, though he offered to pay compensation for the treasure he had taken. The negotiations collapsed when Paris stood and declared that Helen had come willingly, that she was his by right of conquest and the favor of the gods. Menelaus would have drawn his sword then and there if not for the sacred laws of hospitality that protected envoys. Instead, he fixed Paris with a stare that promised death and spoke words that would echo through the ages. The next time they met, he said, it would be with bronze in hand and no protection but their shields. The Greek envoys departed, and both sides prepared for a war that would consume a generation. What followed was not the swift, decisive campaign that many had expected, but a grinding war of attrition that tested the endurance of both armies. The Greeks could not breach Troy's mighty walls, while the Trojans lacked the naval power to break the blockade that slowly strangled their trade routes. Months turned to years as the two forces settled into a deadly routine of raids, skirmishes, and occasional major battles that decided nothing. The Greek camp grew into a city of its own, with permanent structures replacing the original tents and a complex hierarchy developing among the various kings and their contingents. Supply lines stretched back across the Aegean to the Greek homeland, while merchant ships brought provisions, weapons, and fresh troops to maintain the siege. The Trojans, meanwhile, transformed their city into an armed fortress where every citizen had a role in the defense. Women and children worked in the armories, forging spearheads and arrowheads, while the elderly served as lookouts on the walls. The great gates remained sealed except for military sorties, and the once bustling markets fell silent as the blockade took its toll. Both sides launched raids on each other's allies, seeking to weaken their enemies' resolve and capture resources needed for the long struggle. Achilles proved particularly devastating in these operations, sacking 12 cities along the coast and earning a fearsome reputation that preceded him like a storm wind. His raids brought slaves, gold, and provisions back to the Greek camp, but also increased the hatred between the two sides as atrocities mounted on both fronts. The gods themselves took sides in the conflict, with Athena, Hera, and Poseidon supporting the Greeks while Apollo, Artemis, and Aphrodite favored Troy. Their interventions turned individual battles into cosmic struggles as divine power clashed with divine power above the heads of mortal warriors. Zeus, king of the gods, tried to remain neutral, but found himself repeatedly drawn into the conflict as other deities pressed their cases. The war dragged on through its third year, then its fourth, then its fifth, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. Heroes fell on both sides, their names added to the growing catalog of the war's casualties, while new champions rose to take their places in the endless cycle of violence. The siege of Troy had become more than a war. It had become a way of life for an entire generation of warriors who knew no other existence than the daily struggle for survival on the windy plains before the city walls. The 10th year of the Trojan War began much like the 9 that had preceded it, with the Greeks camped on the beaches and the Trojans secure behind their walls. But beneath the surface of this familiar routine, tensions were building that would transform the entire character of the conflict. The catalyst for this transformation came from an unexpected source, not a great battle or divine intervention, but a quarrel over prisoners taken in a recent raid. Agamemnon had claimed as his prize a young woman named Chryses, daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo. The old priest came to the Greek camp with gold and sacred ribbons, begging for his daughter's return and offering a generous ransom. But Agamemnon, drunk on his power as supreme commander, dismissed the priest with harsh words and threats. This act of hubris would prove catastrophic for the Greek army. Apollo, protector of his faithful priest, sent a plague that swept through the Greek camp like wildfire. For 9 days, the funeral pyres burned continuously as warriors fell not to Trojan spears, but to the gods' invisible arrows. The army that had seemed invincible was being decimated by disease. Achilles, greatest of the Greek warriors, finally called an assembly to address the crisis that threatened to destroy them all. The prophet Calchas, trembling with fear, revealed the truth. Apollo's anger could only be appeased by returning Chryses to her father without ransom. Agamemnon, faced with the collapse of his army, had no choice but to agree. But his pride, wounded by this public humiliation, demanded compensation. "If I must give up my prize," he declared, "then I will take another's in its place." His eyes fell upon Achilles, and specifically upon Briseis, the beautiful captive who had become Achilles' beloved companion. What followed was perhaps the most consequential argument in all of ancient literature. Achilles, his honor insulted and his heart wounded by the threatened loss of Briseis, rose in fury against his commander. "You are shameless and greedy beyond measure," he shouted before the assembled army. "You sit safely in your tent while others fight and die, then claim the best of everything for yourself." The confrontation escalated rapidly, with both men hurling accusations and threats. Agamemnon, his authority challenged before the entire army, struck back with calculated cruelty. "Yes, I will take your prize, and you will know how much greater I am than you." Achilles' hand moved to his sword, and for a moment it seemed he might cut down the Greek commander where he stood. Only the intervention of Athena, visible to him alone, stayed his hand. Instead, he made a vow that would echo through the ages. He would withdraw from the fighting entirely. "Without me and my Myrmidons," he declared, "you will see how quickly the Trojans drive you back to your ships. And when Hector is burning your vessels and slaughtering your men, you will remember this day and regret your arrogance." The assembly dissolved in shock and confusion as Achilles stalked back to his ships, his closest companion Patroclus at his side. True to his word, Agamemnon's heralds came to claim Briseis, and though Achilles let her go without violence, his heart burned with rage and wounded pride. The absence of Achilles from the battlefield was felt immediately. Without their greatest champion, the Greeks found themselves steadily pushed back by Hector and the reinvigorated Trojan forces. Day after day, the fighting grew more desperate as the Trojans pressed their advantage. Heroes who had fought with confidence now found themselves struggling merely to survive. Agamemnon himself was wounded, along with Diomedes and Odysseus, leaving the Greek forces increasingly demoralized. The Trojans, sensing victory within their grasp, launched increasingly bold attacks that brought them closer to the Greek ships than ever before. Hector, Troy's greatest defender, seemed unstoppable as he carved through the Greek ranks like a force of nature. His bronze spear found its mark again and again, and his presence on the battlefield inspired his men to feats of extraordinary courage. For the first time since the war began, the Greeks faced the real possibility of complete defeat. As the situation grew increasingly desperate, Patroclus could no longer bear to watch his fellow Greeks suffer while his beloved friend nursed his wounded pride. He came to Achilles with tears in his eyes, begging him to either rejoin the fight or at least allow the Myrmidons to return to battle. "If you will not fight yourself," Patroclus pleaded, "then let me wear your armor and lead your men. The sight of your famous gear might be enough to give the Trojans pause and rally our dispirited forces." Achilles, moved by his friend's distress but still burning with anger against Agamemnon, agreed to this compromise. He helped Patroclus don the divine armor that Thetis had brought from the forges of Hephaestus, armor that gleamed like the sun itself. But as he did so, he gave strict instructions: drive the Trojans back from the ships, but do not pursue them to the city walls. Be content with saving our people and return safely to me. These words, spoken in love and concern, would prove tragically prophetic. Patroclus led the Myrmidons into battle, with all the fury of a storm breaking upon the shore. The Trojans, seeing what they believed to be Achilles himself charging toward them, fell back in terror. For a time, it seemed as though the tide of battle had turned decisively. But Patroclus, intoxicated by success and the thrill of wearing his hero's armor, forgot Achilles' warning. He pursued the fleeing Trojans toward the city, where Hector waited to make his stand. The duel between Patroclus and Hector was brief but decisive. Though Patroclus fought with the courage of a lion, he was no match for Troy's greatest champion. Hector's spear found its mark, and Patroclus fell beneath the walls of Troy, his life's blood staining the divine armor. The news of his friend's death struck Achilles like a physical blow. His rage against Agamemnon was instantly transformed into something far more terrible, an all-consuming desire for vengeance against Hector and all of Troy. The grief-stricken hero rolled in the dust, tearing his hair and crying out in anguish that echoed across the battlefield. His mother Thetis, hearing his lamentations from the depths of the sea, came to comfort her son and to bring him new armor forged by Hephaestus himself. This armor, even more magnificent than the first, would become legendary, its shield depicting the entire cosmos in intricate detail. When Achilles finally emerged from his tent, reconciled with Agamemnon and ready to return to battle, the very earth seemed to tremble beneath his feet. The wrath of Achilles, no longer directed against his fellow Greeks, but focused entirely on their enemies, would soon transform the Trojan War from a siege into a massacre. The greatest warrior of his age was about to unleash his full fury upon the city that had taken his dearest friend, and nothing would ever be the same. The wrath of Achilles had burned bright and terrible, consuming Hector and many other Trojan champions in its fury. But even the greatest of warriors cannot escape the threads of fate that the fates themselves have woven. As Achilles pursued fleeing Trojans around the walls of their city, his heel, the one vulnerable spot his mother Thetis had failed to protect when she dipped him in the river Styx, would prove his undoing. Paris, guided by the god Apollo, drew his bow with trembling hands from the walls of Troy. The arrow flew true, piercing Achilles' heel with divine accuracy, and the mightiest warrior of the age fell like a great oak struck by lightning. His death sent shockwaves through both armies, for men on both sides had come to see him as something more than mortal. The Greeks fought desperately to recover his body, while Hector's younger brother Paris and the Trojans pressed forward to claim their greatest prize. For 17 days and nights, the battle raged over Achilles' corpse, with Ajax the Greater and Odysseus leading the Greeks in their desperate defense of their fallen champion. Finally, they succeeded in bringing his body back to their ships, where his closest friend Patroclus had died before him. The funeral of Achilles became a spectacle that would be remembered for generations. His mother Thetis emerged from the depths of the sea with her sister sea nymphs, their lamentations echoing across the waters like the crying of gulls. The Greeks burned his body on a pyre that could be seen from the walls of Troy, mixing his ashes with those of Patroclus in a golden urn crafted by Hephaestus himself. Games were held in his honor, with prizes of gold and silver, but the greatest prize was Achilles' own armor, forged by the god of fire. The contest for these divine weapons would drive a wedge between the remaining Greek heroes that would have consequences far beyond the walls of Troy. Both Ajax the Greater and Odysseus claimed the right to inherit Achilles' magnificent armor. Ajax argued that he was the mightier warrior, that he had saved Achilles' body from the Trojans when others had fled in panic. His strength was legendary, his courage unquestioned, and his lineage noble, for he was grandson to Aeacus, king of Aegina. But Odysseus, ever clever with words, made a different case before the assembled Greek kings. He argued that wars were won not just by strength of arm, but by cunning of mind, that his strategies had brought them closer to victory than any sword thrust. He reminded them of how he had discovered Achilles on Skyros, how his plans had captured Trojan allies, how his wisdom had guided them through countless challenges. When the secret vote was counted, Odysseus had won by a single ballot, and the armor was his. Ajax, driven mad by what he saw as an unforgivable insult, planned to murder the Greek leaders in their sleep. But Athena, goddess of wisdom, clouded his mind with madness, and instead of killing his enemies, he slaughtered a flock of sheep, believing them to be Agamemnon and the other kings. When dawn broke and Ajax realized what he had done, shame overwhelmed him like a crushing wave. Unable to live with the disgrace, he fell upon his own sword, and his blood watered the Trojan soil. The Greeks had lost another of their greatest champions, not to enemy action, but to their own pride and division. His death was an omen that even victory might come at a price too terrible to bear. With Achilles dead and Ajax fallen by his own hand, the Greeks faced a terrible truth. 10 years of siege had brought them no closer to breaching Troy's mighty walls, and their greatest warriors were gone. The city remained as defiant as ever, its walls unbroken, its gates sealed tight against all assault. Agamemnon spoke of abandoning the siege, of returning to Greece with whatever honor they could salvage from this endless war. But Odysseus, now bearing the armor of Achilles, proposed a plan so audacious that many thought him mad. If they could not break Troy by force, perhaps they could take it by deception, using the very pride of the Trojans against them. Working in secret with Epeius, the master craftsman of the Greek army, Odysseus designed a massive wooden horse, hollow inside and large enough to conceal 30 of their best warriors. The horse was carved from the timber of Mount Ida, decorated with gold and silver, and inscribed with words dedicating it to Athena for safe passage home. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, so beautiful and imposing that even the Greeks who built it stood in awe of their creation. While the horse was being constructed, the rest of the Greek army prepared for the most elaborate deception in the history of warfare. They would burn their camp, board their ships, and sail away, but only as far as the island of Tenedos, where they would wait hidden behind its rocky shores. One man, Sinon, a cousin of Odysseus, would remain behind to tell a carefully crafted lie that would seal Troy's fate. On the appointed night, the Greeks set fire to their camp, the flames lighting up the sky like a second dawn. The Trojans, watching from their walls, could hardly believe their eyes as the ships that had blockaded their harbor for 10 long years finally sailed away. When morning came, the beach was empty except for the smoldering ruins of the Greek camp and the magnificent wooden horse standing silent on the sand. The Trojans poured out of their gates like water released from a dam, hardly able to believe that their ordeal was finally over. Children who had never seen the world beyond Troy's walls ran laughing across the battlefield where so many heroes had died. Women wept with joy and relief, while men examined the abandoned Greek fortifications with wonder and growing excitement. But it was the wooden horse that drew their attention most of all, standing like a monument to their victory. Some urged caution, remembering the cunning of Odysseus and the many tricks the Greeks had attempted over the years. Laocoon, priest of Poseidon, warned his countrymen with prophetic words that would echo through history. "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," he cried, and hurled his spear at the horse's flank, where it stuck quivering in the wood. If the Trojans had listened to his warning, if they had examined the horse more carefully, the war might have ended differently. But fate and the gods had other plans, and just as Laocoon spoke his warning, Greek soldiers appeared, dragging a prisoner. This was Sinon, dirty and bloodied, claiming to be a deserter who had escaped Greek sacrifice. With tears streaming down his face, he told a tale of woe that would have moved stones to pity. The Greeks, he said, had grown weary of the war and wished to return home, but the gods demanded a human sacrifice for safe passage. He himself had been chosen as the victim, but had escaped in the night when his guards grew careless. The horse, he explained, was an offering to Athena, made deliberately large so the Trojans could not bring it into their city. For if they did, the goddess would protect Troy forever, and the Greeks could never return to finish what they had started. King Priam, aged and weary from 10 years of war, wanted to believe that peace had finally come. Against the advice of his wisest counselors, he ordered the horse brought into the city as a trophy of their victory. The wooden horse was so large that the Trojans had to widen their gates and tear down part of their wall to bring it inside. All day they labored, using ropes and rollers, while the hidden Greeks sweated in the darkness of their hollow prison. As evening fell, the horse stood in the central square of Troy, surrounded by celebrating crowds who had no idea they were dancing around their own doom. The Trojans feasted and drank wine until late into the night, their joy and relief making them careless. Guards who should have been watching the walls were instead joining the celebration, and the city that had stood vigilant for 10 years finally let down its guard. When midnight came and the city lay in drunken sleep, Sinon crept to the horse and gave the signal. A hidden panel opened in its belly, and one by one, 30 Greek warriors dropped silently to the ground. Odysseus led them through the dark streets, their sandaled feet making no sound on the ancient stones. Some went to the gates to signal the returning Greek fleet, while others spread throughout the city to begin the slaughter. Fire was their first weapon, and soon flames were leaping from house to house, turning night into terrible day. The Trojans woke to find their city burning around them, their enemies already inside their walls. Men rushed from their beds only to find Greek swords waiting in their doorways. Women and children fled screaming through streets that had become rivers of fire and blood. King Priam, roused by the sounds of battle, armed himself with weapons he had not worn in decades. But age had weakened him, and he fell before the altar of Zeus, cut down by Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles. Hector's wife Andromache was dragged from her home to become a slave, while their infant son Astyanax was hurled from the city walls to prevent any future revenge. Helen, the cause of all this suffering, was found by Menelaus in Paris's palace, cowering behind a curtain. For a moment, her husband's sword was raised to strike her down, but her beauty, unchanged by 10 years of war, stayed his hand. By dawn, the great city of Troy was nothing but burning ruins, its towers collapsed, its walls breached, its people dead or enslaved. The Greeks loaded their ships with treasure beyond counting, gold and silver, precious stones, and works of art accumulated over centuries of trade. But their victory came with a price that many would not live to regret. The gods, disgusted by the sacrilege and slaughter, would scatter the Greek fleet across the wide, dark sea, and few would reach their homes without suffering. The Trojan War was over, but its consequences would echo through the ages, inspiring poets and storytellers to sing of heroes and tragedy, of love and war, of the price of pride and the weight of destiny. In the ashes of Troy lay the seeds of legend, and from that legend would grow stories that would never die. The vast Greek fleet carved its path across the Aegean like a moving city of timber and canvas stretched across the blue waters. White foam churned beneath 1,000 hulls as oarsmen pulled in rhythm to the steady beat of drummers. On the lead ship, Agamemnon stood at the prow, his crimson cloak snapping in the wind, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where Troy awaited. After days of sailing, the lookouts finally spotted the coastline of the Troad, that fertile plain where the great city of Troy commanded the entrance to the Hellespont. The sight that greeted the Greeks was both magnificent and daunting. Troy rose from the coastal plain like a crown of stone and bronze, its massive walls gleaming in the afternoon sun. The city had been built and rebuilt over generations, each layer adding to its strength and grandeur. The walls themselves were a marvel of ancient engineering, constructed with massive blocks of limestone fitted so perfectly that not even a knife blade could slip between them. These fortifications rose 40 feet high in places, topped with battlements where Trojan sentries could be seen moving like ants in the distance. 6 great gates pierced the walls, each one a masterwork of defensive architecture with towers flanking the entrances and multiple barriers to slow any attacking force. The most famous of these was the Scaean Gate, which faced toward the Greek landing site and would witness countless battles in the years to come. From the harbor, the Greeks could see the upper citadel of Troy rising even higher, where King Priam's palace dominated the skyline with its painted columns and golden ornaments catching the light. The sight of such a formidable stronghold gave pause, even to the most confident Greek warriors. This was no simple coastal town that could be taken by storm in a single day. This was a fortress that had withstood sieges before, and clearly intended to withstand this one as well. As the Greek ships approached the shoreline, they found the beaches already lined with Trojan defenders. Hector had not been idle during the days of the Greek approach. Word of the massive fleet had reached Troy when it was still far out at sea, and the crown prince had used that time to marshal every available warrior. The Trojans stood in gleaming bronze armor, their shields locked together in a defensive wall, their spears bristling like a forest of iron points. Behind them, archers waited with arrows nocked, ready to rain death upon any Greeks who attempted to land. The sight of this organized resistance forced the Greek commanders to reconsider their approach. They had hoped to establish a beachhead quickly and begin the siege immediately, but it was clear that the Trojans intended to contest every foot of sand. Agamemnon called a council of war aboard his flagship, summoning all the major kings and princes to decide their strategy. The debate was fierce and prolonged. Some argued for an immediate assault, claiming that Greek valor would overcome Trojan preparation. Others counseled patience, suggesting they should sail further along the coast to find an undefended landing site. Achilles, young and eager for glory, spoke passionately for a direct attack. His Myrmidons were the finest warriors in the Greek army, he declared, and they would carve a path through the Trojan lines that others could follow. Odysseus, ever the strategist, urged caution and proposed a more subtle approach that might divide the Trojan forces. In the end, it was Agamemnon himself who made the decision. They would land here, on the beaches before Troy, and they would do it with overwhelming force. The entire fleet would approach simultaneously, making it impossible for the Trojans to concentrate their defense at any single point. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed to foreshadow the bloodshed to come, the Greek ships moved into position. The sound of bronze weapons, being sharpened, filled the air, mixed with the prayers of warriors preparing for battle. Dawn broke with the clash of bronze on bronze as the Greeks launched their assault. Ship after ship drove onto the sandy shore, their bronze, reinforced prows grinding against the beach as warriors leaped over the sides into the shallow water. The Trojans met them at the water's edge, and the sound of battle echoed across the plain like thunder. Spears flew through the morning air, finding gaps in armor and dropping men into the surf where their blood mingled with the salt water. The Greeks had the advantage of numbers, but the Trojans fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland. Hector himself led the Trojan charge, his bronze armor gleaming as he cut down Greek warriors with his long spear. His presence inspired the defenders, and for a time it seemed the landing might be repelled entirely. But the sheer weight of the Greek assault eventually began to tell. Achilles and his Myrmidons carved a bloody path up the beach, their disciplined formation cutting through the Trojan lines like a spear point through flesh. Ajax the Greater used his massive shield to create a moving fortress, behind which other Greeks could advance in relative safety. Diomedes led his own contingent in a flanking maneuver that threatened to surround a section of the Trojan line. As the battle raged, individual acts of heroism emerged from the general chaos. A young Trojan warrior named Protesilaus was the first Greek to set foot on Trojan soil, but he paid for that honor with his life, struck down by Hector's spear before he could take another step. His death was mourned by his comrades, but also served as inspiration, proving that Trojan blood could be spilled just as easily as Greek. The fighting continued throughout the morning, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Bodies piled up in the surf, and the sand became slick with blood and seawater. By midday, the Greeks had finally secured enough of the beach to begin landing their supplies and equipment. The Trojans, recognizing that they could not hold the shoreline indefinitely, began a fighting withdrawal toward the safety of their walls. Hector managed this retreat with skill, keeping his forces organized and preventing the Greeks from turning withdrawal into rout. As the Trojans fell back, the Greeks began the massive task of establishing their camp. Thousands of men needed shelter, food, and fresh water. Ships had to be dragged up onto the beach and secured against storms. Weapons and armor required maintenance after the morning's fighting. The Greek camp gradually took shape along the shoreline, stretching for miles in both directions. Each contingent established its own section, with the ships drawn up in neat rows and temporary shelters erected behind them. Agamemnon's quarters occupied the center of the camp, marked by his banner and surrounded by the ships of his Mycenaean followers. To one side, Achilles established the Myrmidon camp, while Ajax and his men from Salamis took position on the other flank. The camp became a city in its own right, complete with its own markets, workshops, and gathering places. Blacksmiths set up forges to repair damaged weapons and armor. Merchants who had followed the fleet began trading with the warriors, exchanging luxury goods for plunder taken in the landing. Healers established medical stations to tend the wounded from the morning's battle. As night fell on that first day, both armies took stock of their situation. The Greeks had achieved their immediate objective of establishing a foothold on Trojan soil, but the cost had been higher than expected. The Trojans had been forced to yield the beach, but their main force remained intact and their city walls remained unbreached. Both sides now understood that this would not be the swift campaign that some had envisioned. The siege of Troy had begun, and it would test the endurance and courage of an entire generation of heroes. From the walls of Troy, the defenders could see the campfires of the Greek army stretching along the shore like a constellation of stars. In the Greek camp, warriors sharpened their weapons and told stories of the day's fighting, already beginning to weave the legends that would outlive them all. The eastern horizon beckoned with promise and peril as the massive Greek fleet continued its island-hopping journey toward Troy. For many of the warriors aboard these black ships, this expedition represented their first venture beyond the familiar waters of their homeland. The route they followed was deliberately indirect, wending from island to island across the wide, dark Aegean Sea like a great serpent seeking its prey. Each evening brought the welcome sight of a sheltered cove or protected beach where the fleet could make camp for the night. The routine became familiar yet never mundane, beaching the vessels above the tide line, gathering driftwood for cooking fires, and sending hunting parties inland to seek fresh meat and water. While common soldiers occupied themselves with the practical matters of survival, the kings and princes would gather around the largest fires to debate strategy and share intelligence about their ultimate destination. These nightly councils revealed both the unity and the fractures within the Greek alliance, as different leaders advocated for different approaches to the coming siege. Not every island welcomed the Greek fleet with open arms or willing cooperation. Some communities, calculating the odds of Greek success against Trojan power, feared the terrible reprisals that would surely follow if they aided an expedition that ultimately failed. These pragmatic islanders, thinking of their own survival, refused to provide the supplies and fresh water that the fleet desperately needed. Other islands maintained stronger ties to Troy through generations of trade relationships or marriage alliances, making them natural enemies of the Greek cause. When diplomacy failed and necessity demanded action, the Greeks took by force what was not freely offered. The first blood of what would become the legendary Trojan War was shed not beneath the towering walls of Ilium, but on these scattered, forgotten islands whose names history would barely remember. Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, quickly distinguished himself in these preliminary conflicts that tested the mettle of the expedition. On the island of Tenedos, local forces attempted to ambush the Greeks as they came ashore seeking fresh water from the island's springs. The young Myrmidon prince responded to this treachery with devastating effectiveness, leading a counterattack that scattered the defenders like leaves before a storm. His bronze spear flashed in the Mediterranean sunlight as he carved through enemy ranks, establishing a reputation for martial prowess that would echo through the ages. It was during the conquest of Tenedos that Achilles claimed as his prize the maiden Briseis, daughter of a local priest. This seemingly minor acquisition would later trigger the wrath that forms the central tragedy of Homer's great epic, though none could foresee such consequences in that moment of victory. The fleet's next significant stop was the sacred island of Lemnos, where an event occurred that would haunt the expedition for years to come. Philoctetes, the renowned archer who carried the mighty bow of Heracles, suffered a terrible misfortune while exploring a shrine dedicated to the hero, god. A venomous serpent, guardian of the sacred precinct, struck his foot with fangs that delivered a poison more terrible than death itself. The wound festered and putrefied, producing a stench so overwhelming that his fellow warriors could not bear to remain in his presence. The infection also caused Philoctetes to cry out in agony at unpredictable intervals, disrupting the sleep and morale of the entire camp. Following the counsel of Odysseus, who argued that the expedition could not afford to be slowed by one man's suffering, Agamemnon made the cruel decision to abandon the archer on Lemnos. They left him with his bow, some supplies, and the bitter knowledge that his former comrades had discarded him like a broken weapon. This harsh pragmatism would later force the Greeks to humbly return and beg for aid from the man they had so callously abandoned. As the fleet drew closer to Trojan waters, the mood among the leaders grew increasingly tense and introspective. Menelaus, the wronged husband whose stolen wife had sparked this massive undertaking, found himself consumed by doubts that gnawed at his resolve. 10 long years had passed since he had last looked upon Helen's face. 10 years in which his love had slowly transformed into something darker and more complex. During sleepless nights beneath the star-scattered sky, he would confide his fears to his brother Agamemnon, asking questions that had no comfortable answers. "Will she remember me as I remember her?" he would whisper, staring into the dying embers of their fire. "Will she still possess that God-touched beauty that made her the most desired woman in the world? Or has time dimmed her radiance like a lamp running low on oil?" Agamemnon offered what comfort he could, but his own thoughts dwelled on different matters entirely. The High King's ambitions extended far beyond recovering his brother's wayward wife. He dreamed of Troy's legendary wealth and the eternal glory that would come from conquering a city thought to be unconquerable. In his quieter moments, however, his mind would inevitably return to Aulis and the terrible sacrifice he had made to secure favorable winds for this expedition. The memory of Iphigenia's final moments haunted him, though he pushed such thoughts away whenever they threatened to surface. Before the main fleet could approach Troy itself, the commanders faced a crucial strategic decision about where to attempt their landing. Troy's immediate coastline offered few beaches suitable for landing such a massive force, and the Trojans would certainly be watching these obvious approaches with particular vigilance. Nestor, whose wisdom had been earned through decades of warfare and diplomacy, counseled a cautious approach that would minimize their initial risks. "We should not announce our arrival with the full strength of our fleet," the old king advised during one of their strategic councils. "Let us instead send a smaller advance force to secure a proper landing site and assess the strength of Trojan defenses before committing our main army." The Odysseus, whose cunning mind was already working several moves ahead in this deadly game, agreed with Nestor's basic strategy, but added his own refinement. "Before we commit ourselves to what may be a long and bloody siege," he suggested, "we should at least attempt to resolve this matter through diplomatic means. Well, perhaps when Priam sees the size of our expedition and understands our determination, he will choose to return Helen and offer appropriate compensation, rather than risk the destruction of his city." The combined wisdom of these experienced leaders shaped their final approach to the Trojan coast. A small advance fleet would proceed directly to establish a beachhead, while the main force would remain hidden among the offshore islands, ready to surge forward once a secure landing site had been prepared. Odysseus would lead a diplomatic embassy to Troy once the initial landing had been accomplished, offering Priam one final opportunity to avoid the catastrophe of war. The advance ships, led by Protesilaus of Phylace, approached the Trojan shore in the pale light of dawn, their bronze fittings gleaming as the sun crested the eastern mountains. From concealed positions among the coastal rocks and dunes, Trojan archers had been watching the horizon for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment. As the lead vessel ground against the sandy beach and lowered its gangplank, a deadly rain of arrows arced through the morning air. Protesilaus, burning with desire for the honor of being the first Greek to set foot on Trojan soil, leaped from his ship with his round shield raised high above his head. A Trojan arrow, guided by fate or skill, found the narrow gap between his shield rim and bronze breastplate, piercing his lung with its barbed point. The young king staggered forward 3 determined steps onto Trojan sand before collapsing, his blood the first to stain the foreign shore. In that tragic moment, he fulfilled an ancient prophecy that the first Greek to touch Trojan land would also be the first to die in the coming war. Despite this inauspicious beginning that seemed to bode ill for their entire enterprise, the advance force pressed their attack with grim determination. They drove back the Trojan defenders through sheer weight of numbers and secured a section of beach large enough to accommodate the massive fleet that waited beyond the horizon. The stage was now set for the greatest siege in ancient history to begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Trojan plain as two great armies faced each other for the first time in what would become the most legendary conflict of the ancient world. The Greek forces, numbering in the tens of thousands, stretched in gleaming bronze lines from the shore, almost to the very walls of Troy itself. Behind them, their black ships lay beached like sleeping sea monsters, while ahead loomed the massive fortifications that had never fallen to any enemy. From the towering gates of Troy emerged the city's defenders, their polished armor reflecting the early light as they took their positions on the battlefield. Prince Hector, Troy's greatest warrior, rode at their head on a magnificent chariot, his bronze-tipped spear catching the sun like a beacon of defiance. The sight of him sent murmurs through the Greek ranks, for his reputation as a fighter was known even across the wide, dark sea. As the armies drew closer, individual champions began to emerge from both sides, eager to win glory in single combat before the general melee began. This was the heroic tradition of warfare, where great warriors would meet between the lines while their comrades watched and cheered. The first to step forward was Ajax the Great, son of Telamon, whose massive shield was said to be made from 7 layers of ox hide bound with bronze. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, he was an imposing figure who had never met his match in battle, and his challenge rang across the field like thunder. From the Trojan ranks came Aeneas, son of Anchises and the goddess Aphrodite herself, his divine heritage evident in his graceful movements and fearless bearing. The two champions met in the space between the armies, their spears clashing with a sound like breaking trees as thousands watched in breathless silence. For what seemed like hours they fought, neither able to gain a decisive advantage, their weapons ringing against bronze armor and leather shields. Finally, as the sun climbed higher, the heralds of both armies called for the combat to end, declaring it a draw that honored both warriors equally. But this single combat was merely the prelude to the greater violence that would follow, as the main forces finally clashed with a roar that shook the very foundations of Troy. The battle raged from dawn until dusk, with neither side able to claim victory, and when darkness finally separated the combatants, hundreds lay dead on the blood-soaked earth. What followed that first engagement was a pattern that would repeat itself for 9 long years, with small variations that never seemed to break the fundamental stalemate. Some days the Greeks would press forward, driving the Trojans back toward their walls and threatening to break through their defenses entirely. Other days saw Trojan sorties that pushed the invaders back toward their ships, raising hopes that the siege might finally be lifted. But always, just when one side seemed on the verge of decisive victory, some intervention would restore the balance and prolong the conflict. The gods themselves seemed determined to prevent either army from achieving a quick resolution, as if they found entertainment in mortal suffering. Zeus, the king of the gods, had forbidden direct divine intervention, but this prohibition was honored more in the breach than in the observance. Athena would inspire Greek heroes at crucial moments, while Apollo would guide Trojan arrows to their marks, and Ares would fill warriors on both sides with battle fury. The war became a chess game played by immortals, with mortal men as pieces to be moved and sacrificed according to divine whims. Meanwhile, the siege took on the characteristics of a second city, as the Greek camp grew into a sprawling settlement complete with markets, workshops, and temporary temples. Merchants arrived from across the Mediterranean, drawn by the prospect of selling supplies to an army that seemed to have unlimited resources. The warriors themselves began to establish routines, fighting fierce battles during the day and then retiring to feast and tell stories around their campfires at night. As months turned to years, the initial enthusiasm for glory and quick victory gave way to a grim determination simply to endure. Veterans of the early battles found themselves training new arrivals who had been boys when the expedition first set sail from Aulis. The siege became a way of life rather than a temporary campaign, with both sides adapting to the reality of prolonged warfare. The Greeks built more permanent fortifications around their camp, including a great wall and ditch that could protect their ships from Trojan attacks. Inside Troy, the citizens learned to live with the constant threat of assault, while their warriors developed new tactics for defending the walls. Supplies became a constant concern for both armies, as the local countryside was stripped bare by the demands of feeding so many men. The Greeks sent raiding parties to attack Trojan allies and supply lines, while also dispatching ships back to Greece to bring fresh provisions and reinforcements. Troy's allies from across Asia Minor continued to send aid, but the burden of supporting the siege was gradually wearing down the entire region. Plague struck both camps repeatedly, carrying off warriors who had survived countless battles and adding disease to the ever-present threats of sword and spear. The war that had begun with such grand gestures and heroic ambitions had settled into a grinding contest of endurance that tested not just courage, but the very will to continue. Yet neither side was willing to admit defeat or accept a compromise that might end the bloodshed, for too much honor and too many lives had already been invested in the outcome. The plain of Troy had become a vast cemetery where the dreams of glory lay buried with the bones of heroes, but still the armies faced each other each dawn, ready to add new names to the endless roll of the dead. The Greeks, for all their numbers, could not breach Troy's mighty walls. The Trojans, despite occasional successes in the field, could not drive the invaders back into the sea. What had begun as a war of swift conquest had transformed into something far more grinding and terrible. A conflict that would test the endurance of both sides beyond anything they had imagined when they first took up arms. In those early years, the war spread beyond the plain of Troy itself. Realizing that a direct assault on the city might prove impossible, the Greek commanders adapted their strategy to focus on weakening Troy through attrition and isolation. Achilles, the greatest of all Greek warriors, led raids against Troy's allies and supply lines with devastating effectiveness. With his Myrmidons, elite warriors who followed him with unwavering loyalty forged in countless battles, he attacked 12 cities by sea and 11 by land, according to Homer's careful count. Each fell before his fury like wheat before the scythe, adding to his already legendary reputation and filling the Greek camp with plunder and slaves that would sustain their long campaign. Among the cities sacked was Lyrnessus, where Achilles captured Briseis, a noble woman of remarkable beauty and intelligence whom he took as his prize. Though she came to him as a captive, torn from everything she had known and loved, something grew between them that transcended their circumstances. Not love, perhaps, but a mutual respect and understanding that made her more than simply a spoil of war in his eyes. She became his confidante, the one person who could speak to him honestly about the futility and glory of war, and he found in her a peace that the battlefield could never provide. Meanwhile, Odysseus and Diomedes, two of the most cunning Greek commanders, led scouting missions and ambushes that struck at Trojan morale with surgical precision. Using intelligence and stealth where brute strength alone might fail, they disrupted supply convoys, eliminated key leaders, and gathered crucial information about Troy's defenses. During one such daring nighttime mission, they captured Dolon, a Trojan spy who had volunteered to infiltrate the Greek camp in exchange for Hector's promise of Achilles' horses as reward. Under interrogation, Dolon revealed valuable information about Troy's defenses, the location of allied camps, and the movements of Trojan forces before meeting his inevitable end at Greek hands. The Trojans were not passive in these deadly exchanges. Hector, Troy's greatest warrior and Paris's elder brother, led bold sorties against the Greek camp that kept the invaders constantly on edge. With his distinctive helmet crowned with its flowing horsehair plume, he was both a rallying point for Trojan forces and a figure of dread for Greek soldiers who had learned to fear the sound of his war cry. Unlike Paris, whose interests lay more in the pleasures of the palace than the hardships of battle, Hector embodied the highest ideal of Trojan nobility. He was a devoted husband to Andromache, whose love gave him strength, a tender father to his infant son Astyanax, and a tireless defender of his city who never wavered in his duty, despite the mounting cost. When he walked the walls of Troy, soldiers stood straighter and civilians found hope, for in him they saw their best chance of survival against the Greek onslaught. The gods themselves took sides in this mortal conflict with a passion that reflected their own ancient rivalries and wounded pride. Apollo, the far-shooting archer god whose silver bow could bring plague or healing, favored Troy with his divine protection. Aphrodite, who had started the war through her promise to Paris, continued to shield her favorites from harm. Ares, The brutal god of war, who delighted in bloodshed and the clash of bronze on bronze, supported whichever side promised the most spectacular carnage. The Greeks found powerful supporters in Hera and Athena, both still bitter over Paris's judgment that had awarded the golden apple to their rival. Poseidon, the earth shaker who ruled the seas, held an ancient grudge against Troy for a slight committed by a previous king who had refused to pay the god for building the city's walls. Zeus, father of gods and men, attempted to remain neutral in the conflict, though his sympathies often seemed to lean toward the Trojans, perhaps out of pity for the besieged city. Divine intervention manifested in countless ways throughout the long war. Sometimes, a god would deflect an arrow meant for a favored hero at the last possible moment, or strengthen a warrior's arm during a crucial duel. At other times, the immortals took a more direct and dramatic role, appearing on the battlefield in disguise to turn the tide of battle or rescue their chosen champions from certain death. When Aphrodite saw Paris losing a duel to Menelaus, the wronged husband whose wife had been stolen, she wrapped her protégé in a concealing mist and spirited him away to safety in his palace chambers. It was a glorious rescue that did little for the prince's reputation among his own people, who began to whisper that their prince was more coward than hero. Life in the Greek camp settled into established routines over the grinding years of siege. The kings still met in Agamemnon's tent to discuss strategy and plan new assaults, though increasingly these councils dissolved into bitter arguments as frustration grew and tempers frayed. The common soldiers, accepting that this would be no quick campaign of a single season, built more permanent structures for themselves and established a kind of military city on the Trojan shore. They fished in the wine, dark sea, hunted wild boar in the nearby hills, and held athletic competitions to maintain their fighting edge during the inevitable lulls in the fighting. Inside Troy, conditions gradually deteriorated as the siege continued year after grinding year. While the city's massive grain stores and deep wells prevented outright starvation, fresh meat and produce became increasingly rare luxuries reserved for the wealthy and the warriors. The constant state of alert wore heavily on civilians and soldiers alike, creating a tension that never fully lifted even during periods of relative quiet. Children who had been infants when the war began were now old enough to train with wooden swords, preparing to take their places on the walls if the conflict continued much longer. Helen's position in Troy grew more complex and painful as the years passed without resolution. Some Trojans blamed her directly for their suffering, whispering curses as she passed through the streets or openly calling for her return to the Greeks. Others, including the elderly King Priam whose wisdom had grown with his years, treated her with surprising kindness, seeing her as a victim of fate and divine manipulation rather than the willing cause of their troubles. She spent long hours on the walls, watching the distant battles unfold, sometimes called upon to identify Greek heroes for the Trojan observers who had never seen these legendary warriors in peacetime. In the 8th year of the war, a potential turning point arrived with the dramatic appearance of Rhesus, king of Thrace, who came to Troy's aid with fresh troops and magnificent white horses that gleamed like snow in the sunlight. A prophecy stated that if these divine horses drank from the river Scamander and grazed on Trojan grass, the city would never fall to any enemy. Learning of this prophecy through their network of spies, Odysseus and Diomedes prepared for their most daring raid yet. The flames that licked at the Greek ships cast dancing shadows across Achilles' face as he sat motionless in his tent, watching his countrymen fight for their very survival. The greatest warrior of the age had become a spectator to his own war, his legendary armor gathering dust while lesser men bled and died on the plains of Troy. Patroclus paced restlessly behind his friend, unable to bear the sounds of battle that drifted across the camp like the cries of wounded birds. The clash of bronze on bronze, the screams of dying horses, the war cries of Trojan warriors pressing ever closer to the ships that represented the Greeks' only hope of escape. Achilles, Patroclus said, his voice heavy with anguish, Ajax himself has been wounded, and great Diomedes can barely lift his spear. The Trojans have broken through our outer defenses and are fighting among the ships themselves. But Achilles remained unmoved, his eyes cold as winter seas. Let them burn, he replied, his voice carrying the chill of mountain winds. Agamemnon wanted to be high king over all the Greeks. Let him prove worthy of that title without my spear to win his battles. But Patroclus could see the pain beneath his friend's anger, the way Achilles' hands clenched when the sounds of battle grew particularly fierce. This was not mere stubbornness or wounded pride. This was a man torn between his love for his comrades and his sense of honor, between duty to his people and loyalty to his own principles. The friendship between Achilles and Patroclus had been forged in the halls of Peleus's palace, where the young prince of the Myrmidons had been raised alongside the son of Menoetius. They had trained together under the wise centaur Chiron, learned the arts of war and peace side by side, shared dreams of glory that would make their names immortal in song and story. Patroclus was everything Achilles was not, gentle where the prince was fierce, diplomatic where Achilles was direct, beloved by all for his kindness, while Achilles was feared for his terrible prowess in battle. Yet their differences only strengthened the bond between them, each completing what the other lacked, creating a friendship that had become legendary throughout the Greek camp. Now that friendship faced its greatest test as Patroclus watched his beloved companion consumed by a rage that threatened to destroy everything they had fought for. "Do you remember?" Patroclus said softly, settling beside Achilles on the beach. "When we were boys and you swore an oath to your mother that you would never let pride destroy what you loved most." Achilles' jaw tightened, but he did not respond, his gaze fixed on the smoke rising from the burning ships. "Thetis warned you then that your greatest enemy would not be any Trojan warrior, but the fire that burns within your own heart. Too, she said that rage unchecked would consume not just your enemies, but everything dear to you." For a moment, something flickered in Achilles' eyes, a shadow of doubt, or perhaps remembrance of his mother's prophetic words. But then the sound of Greek horns blowing in distress hardened his expression once more. "My mother also told me that I had a choice," he said quietly. "A long life of peace and obscurity, or a short life crowned with eternal glory. I chose glory, Patroclus. But glory means nothing if it can be stripped away by the whim of lesser men." As night fell over the battlefield, the situation for the Greeks became increasingly desperate. Hector had broken through their defensive walls and was leading Trojan warriors in a systematic assault on the beached ships, setting fire to vessel after vessel with brands torn from their own campfires. The smell of burning wood and tar filled the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke of battle to create an atmosphere of apocalyptic destruction. Agamemnon himself appeared at Achilles' tent, his royal robes torn and stained with dust and blood, his face haggard with exhaustion and fear. "Achilles," the High King said, swallowing his pride with visible effort, "I was wrong to take Briseis from you. I will return her untouched, along with 20 talents of gold and 7 cities in my homeland. Only come back to the battle before all is lost." Achilles looked up at the man who had insulted him so publicly, studying Agamemnon's desperate face with cold calculation. "You offer me gold and cities," he said at last. "But what of the honor you stripped from me before all the army? Can your treasures restore what your words destroyed? And can your gifts undo the knowledge that you think so little of my service that you would steal my rightful prize?" Agamemnon's face flushed with anger and frustration, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What would you have me do, Achilles? Prostrate myself before you, declare that you are greater than the King of Kings. I offer you wealth beyond measure and lands to rule. What more can honor demand?" Achilles stood slowly, his full height impressive even without his armor, his presence filling the tent like a gathering storm. "Honor cannot be bought with gold, Agamemnon, nor can respect be purchased with promises of future reward. You have shown all the Greeks that you value me only as a tool to be used and discarded at your pleasure. Find another tool to save your army, for this one is broken beyond your power to repair." But the High King left empty-handed, his shoulders bowed with the weight of impending disaster, while behind him Achilles returned to his vigil by the sea. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins of the Greek camp, Patroclus could bear no more. Half the fleet was already burning, and Trojan warriors were preparing for a final assault that would drive the survivors into the sea. "If you will not fight," he said to Achilles, "then let me take your place. Give me your armor." Let me lead the Myrmidons into battle. The Trojans fear the sight of your bronze and the gleam of your shield. They will retreat thinking you have returned to the fight." Achilles looked at his dearest friend, seeing the determination in Patroclus' eyes, the desperate love for their dying comrades that burned brighter than any personal grievance. "You would die, Patroclus," he said simply. "You are brave and skilled, but you are not me. Hector would kill you as easily as a man swats a fly." "Then I will die as a hero should," Patroclus replied, "fighting for my friends rather than nursing wounded pride. Better to fall with honor than to live with the knowledge that I could have acted but chose not to." The words struck Achilles like physical blows, each one finding its mark in the armor of his righteousness. Slowly, reluctantly, he nodded his consent, knowing even as he did so that he was sending his beloved friend to almost certain death. "Take the armor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lead the Myrmidons into battle, but promise me this: drive the Trojans back from our ships, then return. Do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. Do not seek to win glory that belongs to me alone. Promise me, Patroclus, that you will come back." But even as Patroclus donned the divine armor crafted by Hephaestus himself, both friends knew that such promises were fragile things in the chaos of war. The die was cast, and the wrath of Achilles, meant to punish his enemies, was about to claim the life he treasured most. As the Trojan forces pressed ever closer to the heart of the Greek encampment, their war cries echoing off the hulls of beached ships, the situation grew increasingly desperate. The very vessels that had carried the Greek army across the wine, dark sea from their homeland now stood in imminent danger of being consumed by Trojan torches. Agamemnon, watching from his command tent as smoke began to rise from the first of the burning ships, finally acknowledged the terrible error of his pride. The King of Kings, whose stubbornness had cost the Greeks their greatest warrior, now faced the prospect of total defeat, unless he could somehow repair the damage his arrogance had wrought. With the weight of impending disaster heavy upon his shoulders, Agamemnon assembled an embassy unlike any other in the annals of warfare. He chose 3 men whose combined wisdom, eloquence, and personal connection to Achilles might succeed where royal commands had failed. First was Odysseus, the silver-tongued king of Ithaca, whose reputation for persuasive speech was matched only by his cunning in battle and diplomacy. Second came Ajax, son of Telamon, a warrior whose straightforward nature and proven courage in countless battles had earned him the respect of every Greek fighter, including the sulking Achilles. Third, and perhaps most importantly, was old Phoenix, the grizzled mentor who had helped raise Achilles from boyhood and who knew better than any man the complex heart that beat within the greatest of warriors. These 3 men bore with them an offer so magnificent that it seemed impossible any mortal could refuse it. Agamemnon promised to return Briseis untouched, swearing sacred oaths that he had never shared her bed, along with 7 tripods of gleaming bronze, 10 talents of gold that would make a man wealthy beyond measure, 20 bronze cauldrons for feasting, and 12 swift horses chosen from his own royal stables. Beyond these immediate gifts, he offered 7 women skilled in the finest crafts, their hands capable of weaving tapestries fit for gods, and 20 Trojan captives of Achilles, own choosing should Troy eventually fall to Greek arms. Most remarkably of all, Agamemnon offered one of his own daughters in marriage, along with 7 prosperous towns as her dowry, cities whose fertile fields and busy harbors would provide wealth for generations to come. The embassy made their way through the darkening camp as torches flickered to life and the sounds of wounded men filled the air with their moans. They found Achilles in his tent, seated beside his beloved companion Patroclus, playing a silver lyre and singing of the glorious deeds of heroes long dead. Odysseus presented these magnificent offers with all his famous eloquence, his words flowing like honey as he painted pictures of honor restored and friendship renewed. He spoke of the suffering of their comrades, of brave men dying while their greatest champion remained idle, and of the glory that awaited if Achilles would only set aside his anger and return to the battle that desperately needed him. Ajax, more direct in his approach, reminded Achilles of the sacred bonds of friendship that had united the Greek leaders since the beginning of their great enterprise. He spoke as one warrior to another, without flowery language or diplomatic niceties, appealing to the code of honor that bound all heroes together in brotherhood forged by shared danger and common purpose. Old Phoenix, whose weathered face bore the lines of countless years and whose eyes held the wisdom of long experience, told a parable about the dangers of unyielding anger. He spoke of Meleager, another great hero who had withdrawn from battle in rage, only to see his city suffer terribly before he finally relented and returned to save his people. But Achilles, his heart still burning with the cold fire of wounded pride, remained unmoved by their pleas. "I will not fight for Agamemnon," Achilles declared, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "The man has no honor, and I want nothing from him. Not his gold, not his women, not his friendship. Let him reap what he has sown in the fields of his own arrogance." The hero's rejection cut through the tent like a blade, leaving the three ambassadors stunned by the absolute nature of his refusal. Even Odysseus, master of words and persuasion, found himself speechless in the face of such implacable determination. The embassy returned empty, handed through the camp, their footsteps heavy with the weight of failure, leaving the Greek leaders to prepare for what seemed like inevitable defeat at the hands of Hector's advancing forces. Yet even in his anger, Achilles was not entirely without compassion for his suffering comrades. As Hector's forces pressed ever closer to the heart of the Greek camp and the smell of burning ships began to fill the air, he made a decision that would prove more fateful than any choice he had made since arriving on the shores of Troy. "Wear my armor," Achilles told his beloved friend Patroclus, as the sounds of battle grew ever louder outside their tent. "The Trojans will think I have returned to the fight and may lose heart when they see my distinctive crest upon the battlefield." But even as he spoke these words, Achilles felt a chill of foreboding that he could not entirely explain. "Listen carefully, my friend. Push them back from our ships, but go no further. Do not pursue them to the walls of Troy, for the gods favor Hector within sight of his city." Patroclus agreed to these conditions. Though his heart was already racing with the prospect of glory, and his mind filled with visions of the heroic deeds he might accomplish while wearing the armor of the greatest warrior in the world. He donned the magnificent armor of Achilles piece by piece, each item a masterwork of divine craftsmanship that seemed to sing with its own inner light. The gleaming breastplate molded itself to his chest like a second skin. The graves with their silver ankle clasps caught the torchlight like captured stars, and the ornate shield seemed to pulse with protective power. Most distinctive of all was the helmet with its horsehair crest that could be seen across any battlefield, the very sight of which had struck fear into the hearts of countless Trojan warriors. The effect of Patroclus's appearance was exactly as Achilles had predicted, perhaps even more dramatic than either friend had dared hope. Seeing what they believed was the dreaded Achilles returning to battle after his long absence, many Trojan warriors broke ranks and fled in panic, their courage evaporating like morning mist before the rising sun. But in that moment of triumph lay the seeds of tragedy, for the armor that was meant to protect would become the very instrument of doom. When Achilles finally charged onto the battlefield in his gleaming new armor, the effect was nothing short of apocalyptic. The divine craftsmanship of Hephaestus had created something that transcended mortal weaponry, armor that seemed to capture and reflect the very light of the gods themselves. Trojans who had been confidently pursuing the Greeks just moments before now turned and ran in absolute panic, their battle cries transforming into screams of terror. The sight of what they believed to be an invincible warrior returned from the dead sent shockwaves through their ranks like lightning splitting an ancient oak. Many were cut down as they fled, their backs exposed to Achilles' relentless spear thrust. Others, in their desperate panic to escape this divine fury, plunged headlong into the river Scamander, preferring to risk drowning rather than face the wrath of Achilles. But even the river offered no sanctuary from his vengeance. Achilles followed them into the churning waters, slaughtering Trojans in such staggering numbers that their blood turned the sacred river crimson. The corpses piled so high that they began to dam the flow itself, creating pools of death that stretched from bank to bank. The river god Scamander, ancient and proud, could no longer tolerate this desecration of his waters. Rising up in his full divine majesty, the god spoke with a voice like thunder rolling across the plains. demanding that Achilles cease his slaughter and allow the dead their passage to the underworld. When Achilles ignored this divine warning, consumed as he was by his grief-fueled rage, Scamander unleashed his full power. The river surged upward in massive waves, trying to drown the hero in swirling torrents that would have swept away entire armies. Only the intervention of Hephaestus, who had forged Achilles' armor and felt protective of his creation, saved the warrior from this aquatic doom. The fire god sent flames racing across the water's surface, turning the river to steam and forcing Scamander to retreat back to his normal bounds. Freed from the river's divine clutches, Achilles continued his rampage across the Trojan plain with renewed fury. He drove the surviving Trojans back toward their city like a shepherd herding terrified sheep before a pack of wolves. Warriors who had fought bravely for 9 long years now abandoned all pretense of courage, thinking only of reaching the safety of Troy's mighty walls. At the gates of Troy, as the massive bronze doors swung shut behind the retreating army with a sound like thunder, only one man remained outside. Hector, Troy's greatest champion and the hope of his people, waited alone in the shadow of the walls to face the approaching storm of Achilles' wrath. His father, King Priam, appeared on the battlements above, his aged voice cracking with desperation as he pleaded with his beloved son. "Come inside, my boy," the old king cried, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You have done enough for Troy, more than any man should be asked to bear. Live to fight another day when the odds are not so impossibly stacked against you." His mother, Queen Hecuba, joined her husband's pleas, her voice rising in maternal anguish that could be heard across the entire plain. "My son," she wailed, "do not throw your life away in a gesture of pride. Troy needs you alive more than it needs you dead as a hero. Think of your wife Andromache. Think of your infant son Astyanax, who will grow up fatherless if you fall today." But Hector stood his ground with the quiet dignity that had always marked his character. His bronze armor gleaming in the afternoon sun. "I cannot hide behind walls while others die for my decisions," he replied, his voice carrying clearly to those who loved him most. "I led our forces into battle with confidence when we thought victory was within our grasp. I cannot abandon them now in their hour of greatest fear and despair. If I retreat now, how can I ever again ask a Trojan warrior to stand firm when danger approaches?" As Achilles drew nearer across the blood-soaked plain, however, even Hector's legendary courage began to falter. The man approaching him seemed to have transcended mortal limitations entirely. His divine armor blazed in the sunlight like a second sun, casting reflections that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. His face had become a mask of unstoppable fury, twisted by grief into something barely recognizable as human. This was no longer the Achilles who had sulked in his tent over wounded pride, but something far more dangerous, a force of nature given human form and divine weapons. At the very last moment, as Achilles raised his spear with clear intent to kill, Hector's nerve finally broke. It was not the breaking of a coward, but the instinctive recognition of a mortal man facing something that had moved beyond the realm of human opposition. He ran, not in shame, but in the desperate hope that distance might give him time to think, to plan, to find some way to survive this encounter that seemed destined to end in his death. 3 times they circled the mighty walls of Troy, Achilles in relentless pursuit, Hector in desperate flight. The entire city watched from the battlements as their greatest hero fled from his destiny, understanding that they were witnessing the beginning of the end of their civilization. The gods themselves watched from their thrones on Mount Olympus, some favoring one hero, others supporting his opponent. Apollo, who had protected Hector through countless battles over the long years of war, found his power to intervene constrained by the will of Zeus. Athena, goddess of warfare and wisdom, ensured that Achilles would not tire in his pursuit, lending supernatural strength to his legs and clarity to his vision. It was Athena who finally ended this chase by descending from Olympus in disguise. Appearing to Hector in the perfect likeness of his beloved brother Deiphobus, she called out encouragingly that they should make their stand together against Achilles. "Brother," the disguised goddess said, "let us face this threat side by side as we have faced so many others. 2 spears are better than 1, and together we might find a way to bring down even this seemingly invincible foe." Encouraged by what he believed was his brother's presence, Hector finally turned to make his stand. But when he looked around for Deiphobus, expecting to see his brother's familiar face and ready spear, he found only empty air. In that moment of terrible realization, understanding that he had been deceived by divine intervention and now faced Achilles completely alone, the Trojan prince showed the true measure of his heroic character. Rather than despair or attempt to flee again, he straightened his shoulders and gripped his spear more firmly. If this was to be his final battle, he would face it with the dignity befitting a prince of Troy. The duel between the two greatest warriors of their age was brief, but absolutely terrible in its intensity and consequence. The desperate courage of a man defending everything he loved clashed against the transcendent fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. Hector fought with every skill his years of training had given him, every technique learned in defense of Troy's walls, every desperate stratagem that love for his family could inspire. But Achilles fought with something beyond mortal skill, a rage so pure and terrible that it seemed to channel the very forces of destruction themselves. The outcome was never truly in doubt from the moment their spears first crossed. Achilles' weapon, guided by divine fury and superhuman precision, found the one gap at Hector's throat, one of the few vulnerable spots in the armor that had once belonged to Achilles himself, a cruel irony that the fates had woven into this moment of ultimate tragedy. As Hector lay dying, his lifeblood pooling in the dust beneath Troy's walls, he summoned the strength for one final request. His voice, though weakening, carried the dignity that had made him beloved by his people, and respected even by his enemies. "I beg you, by your own life and by your parents', do not leave my body to be devoured by dogs and birds. Accept the ransom my father will offer, and let him give me proper burial rites, even in death's approach." The Trojan prince thought not of himself, but of the grief his desecration would bring to those who loved him. But Achilles, still consumed by grief and rage that had burned away every trace of mercy or human consideration, was beyond such appeals to honor and decency. "Beg me not by my parents," he snarled, his voice harsh with the pain that had transformed him from hero to something darker and more terrible. "I wish my fury would drive me to cut your flesh and eat it raw for what you've done to Patroclus. No ransom will convince me to return your body. The dogs and birds will have you, as you would have done with Patroclus had you taken him." With his last breath, as the light faded from his eyes, Hector summoned the gift of prophecy that sometimes comes to the dying. "Remember this on the day when Paris and Apollo bring you down before the Scaean gates," he whispered. "Remember my words when your own death finds you." 2. After Hector's death, Achilles' treatment of his enemy's body shocked even his fellow Greeks, men who had grown accustomed to the brutalities of a decade-long war. He pierced the fallen hero's heels with his bronze spear point, threaded them with leather thongs, and tied the corpse behind his chariot, then began a display of vengeance that violated every sacred custom of warfare and funeral rites. Around the city walls he drove in a grim parody of their earlier chase, dragging Hector's body through the dust while the people of Troy watched in horror from their battlements. For 11 days, he continued this desecration, driving around the tomb of Patroclus each morning, with Hector's body trailing behind his wheels. The sight of their beloved prince being dishonored in death sent waves of anguish through Troy that were almost as devastating as his loss in battle. Yet even in this abuse, the gods showed their protection of the noble dead. Hector's body remained unmarked by decay or damage, preserved by divine intervention despite Achilles' fury. The gods themselves were outraged by this violation of sacred custom, this offense against the natural order that governed even the conduct of war. Zeus, king of the immortals, finally intervened through a message delivered by Thetis to her son. "You have angered the immortals with your excessive vengeance." The sea goddess told Achilles, "The time has come to accept ransom and return Hector's body to his people, as honor and divine law demand." On the 12th night, guided by Hermes in disguise, King Priam of Troy made his way secretly through the Greek camp and to Achilles' tent. The old king, who had ruled Troy for decades and seen it rise to greatness, now came as a suppliant to beg for his son's body. He knelt before the man who had killed so many of his sons, most notably his beloved Hector, and in an act of supreme courage and humility, kissed the hands that had brought him such immeasurable grief. "Remember your own father, Achilles," Priam said, his voice steady despite the sorrow that threatened to overwhelm him. "He is old as I am old, and he waits for a son who may never return home from this war. At least he can hope while his son still lives, while I kneel before the killer of my children. Ki, have pity, if not for me, then for the memory of your own father and the grief that awaits him." These words, spoken with such dignity and pain, penetrated Achilles' armor of grief and rage like no weapon ever could. For the first time since Patroclus' death, he wept not just for his beloved friend, but for all that had been lost in this endless cycle of violence and vengeance. He wept for his own approaching death, foretold by prophecy and sealed by his choice to avenge Patroclus. He wept for the futility of war itself, for the way it devoured the best and noblest of men and left only grief in its wake. Together, the old king and the young warrior sat in that tent and grieved for their respective losses, finding a moment of shared humanity amid the waste and horror of war. In that moment, they were not Greek and Trojan, not enemy and enemy, but simply two men united in their understanding of loss and the terrible price of honor. When dawn came, Achilles had Hector's body washed with care, anointed with precious oils, and wrapped in the finest cloth his camp could provide. He granted the Trojans 12 days of peace to conduct proper funeral rites for their champion, a brief respite in a war that had already consumed nearly a decade and the lives of countless heroes. As Hector's funeral pyre burned within the walls of Troy, sending his spirit to whatever realm awaited the noble dead, Achilles stood alone on the shore looking out at the dark sea. His wrath had been quenched in blood and tears, but the price had been immeasurable, and Hector's prophecy remained to be fulfilled. His own death approached as certain as the dawn that would follow this temporary peace. As Hector's funeral pyre burned within the walls of Troy, sending his spirit to whatever realm awaited the noble dead, Achilles stood alone on the shore looking out at the dark sea. His wrath had been quenched in blood and tears, but the price had been immeasurable, and Hector's prophecy remained to be fulfilled. His own death approached as certain as the dawn that would follow this temporary peace. Yet before that fate would claim him, two more great warriors would arrive to test his legendary prowess. The first came from the distant lands of the Amazons, those legendary warrior women who lived beyond the Black Sea. Penthesilea, their queen, arrived at Troy's gates with a force of mounted archers whose skill was matched only by their fierce beauty. She had come to honor an ancient alliance between her people and King Priam, but also to seek glory in battle against the greatest warriors of the age. The Amazons brought new hope to the beleaguered Trojans, who had watched their greatest champion burn on his funeral pyre. These warrior women fought with a savagery and skill that reminded the Greeks why the Amazons were feared throughout the known world. Penthesilea herself was a sight to behold in battle, her bronze armor gleaming as she rode through the Greek lines, her bow singing death songs as arrow after arrow found its mark. They led several successful sorties against the Greek lines, with the queen herself displaying extraordinary prowess in battle. Her spear work was as deadly as her archery, and she moved through combat with a grace that seemed almost divine. Achilles, who had been withdrawing from combat after each day's necessary bloodshed, found himself drawn back to the front lines by tales of this warrior woman's skill. The stories of her prowess intrigued him, for he had grown wary of facing opponents who offered little challenge to his godlike abilities. Here, at last, was someone who might provide the kind of combat that stirred his warrior's heart. Their eventual confrontation was as brief as it was legendary. When they finally met in single combat before the walls of Troy, the very air seemed to crackle with tension. Penthesilea fought with remarkable courage, even managing to pierce Achilles' divine armor with her spear, one of the few to ever wound the seemingly invulnerable hero. Her blade found gaps in his protection that lesser warriors could never have exploited, drawing blood from the son of Thetis. For a moment, it seemed possible that this Amazon queen might accomplish what Hector himself could not. But in the end, Achilles' godlike strength prevailed. His spear, forged by Hephaestus himself, found its mark with terrible precision. As his spear found her heart, their eyes met, and according to some accounts, Achilles fell in love with the Amazon queen in the very moment he killed her. Some say it was her courage that captivated him, others claim it was a curse from Aphrodite, punishing him for his violence. As he removed her helmet, revealing her face in death, the full tragedy of the moment struck him like a physical blow. Her beauty was extraordinary, but it was the nobility in her features, even in death, that moved him most deeply. Some Greeks mockingly suggested that Achilles should take her body to his tent, implying a desecration worse than what he had done to Hector. The crude jest came from Thersites, a common soldier known for his sharp tongue and lack of respect for his betters. Enraged by this disrespect toward a worthy opponent, Achilles killed the man who had spoken. Thersites, a common soldier known for his insolence. His fist struck with such force that Thersites died instantly, his skull crushed by the hero's divine strength. This act divided the Greek camp, with some feeling Achilles had overstepped by killing a fellow Greek over a fallen enemy. The death of Thersites created a rift that would never fully heal, as many questioned whether Achilles had become too dangerous to his own allies. After the Amazons came another unexpected ally for Troy, Memnon, king of Ethiopia, son of the dawn goddess Us. His arrival with a substantial force once again shifted the momentum of battle. The Ethiopians brought with them weapons of bronze and iron that gleamed like captured sunlight, and their king was said to be as beautiful as the dawn his mother brought each day. Memnon's prowess was second only to Achilles, and he cut down many Greek heroes, including Nestor's son, Antilochus, who sacrificed himself to save his elderly father from Memnon's spear. The young man threw himself between the Ethiopian king and his aged father, taking the deadly thrust meant for Nestor. His sacrifice embodied the very best of heroic virtue, choosing death over dishonor. Grief, stricken over the death of Antilochus, who had been dear to him since the loss of Patroclus. Achilles sought out Memnon for a duel that the gods themselves watched with special interest. On Olympus, Zeus weighed the fates of the two heroes on golden scales, and Memnon's scale sank, foretelling his doom. The duel between Achilles and Memnon was long and evenly matched. Both were sons of immortal mothers, both wore divine armor, both fought with superhuman skill. Spears were cast and dodged, swords clashed and shields buckled, until at last Achilles drove his blade beneath Memnon's breastplate. As the Ethiopian king fell, his mother Us wept tears that became the morning dew, and she continues to mourn him each dawn to this day. With each victory, Achilles drew closer to his prophesied doom. Even as the Trojans retreated toward their gates following Memnon's defeat, Paris, who had started the war but rarely distinguished himself in battle, stood with Apollo at the Scaean gate. The god whispered guidance into the prince's ear, for the time had come to fulfill the prophecy spoken over Hector's body. As Achilles pursued the fleeing Trojans, Paris knocked an arrow to his bow, and Apollo guided the shot to the one vulnerable spot on Achilles' body, his heel, which had not been dipped in the river Styx when his mother had sought to make him immortal as an infant. The arrow struck true, piercing the tendon that would forever after bear Achilles' name. The great hero stumbled, then fell, unable to believe that his end had come not at the hands of a worthy opponent in fair combat, but from a distance shot by the man whose actions had launched the war. As Achilles lay dying, Paris and the Trojans moved to take his body, but Ajax and Odysseus fought their way to their fallen comrade, driving back the enemy and recovering the corpse of their greatest warrior. The death of Achilles plunged the Greek camp into mourning more profound even than when Patroclus had fallen. For 17 days, the funeral games held in his honor paused the fighting as heroes competed to honor his memory. His divine armor became the subject of a bitter dispute between Ajax and Odysseus, both of whom had risked their lives to recover his body. When the Greek leaders awarded the armor to Odysseus in recognition of his cunning and strategic mind, Ajax, the physically strongest Greek after Achilles, was driven mad by the slight to his honor. In his madness, he slaughtered a flock of sheep, believing them to be his fellow Greeks who had wronged him. When he came to his senses and realized what he had done, his shame drove him to fall upon his own sword. Thus, within a short span, the Greeks had lost their three greatest warriors, Patroclus, Achilles, and Ajax. Victory seemed more distant than ever, especially when Apollo's priest Calchas revealed that Troy would never fall while it possessed the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena that protected the city. The massive wooden horse stood silhouetted against the crimson sunset, its towering form casting long shadows across the Trojan plain. After 10 grueling years of siege warfare, The sight of empty Greek camps and vanished ships seemed almost too miraculous to believe. The Trojans who ventured cautiously from their gates found only blackened patches in the sand where 1,000 vessels had once crowded the shoreline. The silence was profound after a decade of clashing bronze and dying screams. Yet this strange wooden monument remained, its polished flanks gleaming in the fading light like some divine offering left by the departed invaders. Sinon's performance before the Trojan elders was perhaps the greatest act of theater in military history. Bound and bloodied, he had been discovered tied to a post near the mysterious horse, apparently abandoned by his own countrymen in their hasty retreat. His story unfolded with careful precision, each detail crafted by Odysseus to exploit Trojan psychology. The horse, he claimed with tears streaming down his face, was indeed an offering to Athena, built on the prophet Calchas's urgent instructions. The Greeks had finally acknowledged that they could never take Troy by force and sought divine forgiveness for their hubris in attacking a city protected by the gods. But why? The Trojans pressed, had they made it so impossibly large? Here Sinon's genius showed most clearly as he explained that the Greeks deliberately constructed the horse too massive to fit through Troy's gates. If the Trojans could somehow bring this sacred offering within their walls, he whispered conspiratorially, Athena's protection would transfer from the Greeks to Troy itself. The city would become invulnerable to any future attack. But if they destroyed or defiled the offering, the goddess's wrath would fall upon Troy with devastating consequences. The Trojans found themselves caught in a carefully laid trap of religious fear and political ambition. King Priam and his advisors debated fiercely through the night, with some voices urging extreme caution. Laocoon, the priest of Poseidon, argued most vehemently against bringing the horse inside the city walls. His famous warning echoed through the council chamber like a prophecy of doom itself. He feared the Greeks even when bearing gifts, he declared, and hurled his spear at the horse's wooden flank where it stuck quivering. The hollow sound that resonated from within should have alerted every Trojan to the deception. But the gods themselves seemed to conspire against Troy's salvation that night. As Laocoon prepared to sacrifice a bull to Poseidon, seeking divine guidance about the mysterious horse, two enormous serpents emerged from the sea. The creatures, sent by Athena to silence the priest who might expose Odysseus's stratagem, slithered across the beach with supernatural speed. They coiled around Laocoon and his two young sons, crushing the life from all three despite their desperate struggles. The horrified Trojans interpreted this divine intervention as punishment for Laocoon's impiety in attacking Athena's sacred offering. Surely the gods themselves were commanding them to honor the wooden horse and bring it within their walls. Even Cassandra's frantic warnings fell on deaf ears, as they always had throughout the long war. The cursed prophetess shrieked that the horse concealed armed Greeks within its belly, but her divine punishment ensured that no one would believe her truths. Her brother Helenus, gifted with prophecy but lacking her curse, had already departed Troy in disgust after losing a contest for Helen's hand to Deiphobus. With both seers silenced or ignored, the Trojans proceeded with their fatal decision. The engineering challenge of moving the colossal horse through Troy's gates required demolishing part of the wall itself. Citizens labored through the night, their excitement palpable as they worked to claim what they believed would guarantee their city's eternal security. Ropes and rollers were brought from the harbor, and hundreds of men strained to drag the massive construction up the slope toward the citadel. Children ran alongside, singing victory songs, while women threw flowers from the walls in celebration. The very walls that had protected Troy for 10 years were breached by Trojan hands to admit their own destruction. As darkness fell over the celebrating city, the Trojans indulged in the first truly joyous feast they had enjoyed in a decade. Wine flowed freely through streets that had known only rationing and fear for so many years. Guards abandoned their posts to join the revelry, confident that the departed Greeks posed no further threat. The massive gates stood open for the first time since the war began, and watchmen dozed at their stations. Within the horse's hollow belly, 30 of Greece's finest warriors waited in cramped silence as the sounds of celebration gradually faded into the quiet of deep night. Odysseus had chosen each man carefully for courage, skill, and absolute reliability. Menelaus crouched beside Neoptolemus, Achilles' young son burning for his first taste of real glory. Diomades checked his weapons for the 100th time, while others fought against cramps and the urge to cough. The signal came at midnight when Sinon lit a torch on Troy's highest tower, visible to the Greek fleet waiting behind the nearby island of Tenedos. The ships that had supposedly sailed away in defeat now raced back across the dark water, their oars muffled in bronze weapons, wrapped to prevent any betraying sound. As the hidden warriors emerged from their wooden prison and crept through Troy's sleeping streets, they moved like shadows of vengeance finally unleashed. The city gates were thrown open to admit the returning Greek army, and Troy's long agony reached its climactic hour. 10 years of siege warfare, countless heroes fallen on both sides, and all the suffering that had followed from Paris's fateful choice now rushed toward their inevitable conclusion in fire and blood. The massive wooden horse cast an ominous shadow across Troy's main plaza as the exhausted citizens finally ceased their laborious dragging. What had taken the combined strength of hundreds of men, women, and even children to accomplish now stood as a monument to their supposed victory. The structure towered above the surrounding buildings, its carved features seeming almost alive in the flickering torchlight that illuminated the celebration beginning to unfold around it. King Priam himself emerged from his palace to inspect this strange gift, his aged hands running along the smooth wooden planks as priests chanted prayers to Athena. The old king's weathered face showed the strain of 10 long years of siege, but tonight there was something approaching hope in his tired eyes. His sons Paris and Deiphobus flanked him, both warriors bearing scars from countless battles, yet neither could shake an inexplicable unease about this mysterious offering. The debate that had raged earlier still echoed in whispered conversations throughout the crowd. Laocoon's warnings had been silenced by his horrific death, but his words lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed the priest's final moments. The image of those massive serpents crushing him and his innocent sons remained burned into the collective memory of Troy's people. Some citizens crossed themselves and muttered prayers, wondering if they had witnessed divine justice or divine warning. Yet the majority chose to interpret the priest's death as punishment for his impiety toward Athena's sacred gift. Cassandra's frantic prophecies had been dismissed as usual, though several women in the crowd had felt their hearts grow cold at her words. The cursed princess now sat alone in her chamber, tears streaming down her face as she watched from her window, the very instrument of Troy's destruction being celebrated in the streets below. As darkness settled over Troy, the celebration reached heights of joy not seen since before the war began. Wine merchants opened their stores freely, declaring that no payment would be taken on this night of deliverance. Musicians who had hidden their instruments during the siege brought them out to fill the air with melodies that had been silenced by the constant threat of Greek arrows. Children who had known nothing but war in their young lives laughed and played around the great horse, their parents finally allowing them to venture into the streets without fear. The guards who had maintained constant vigilance for a decade found themselves passed cup after cup of wine by grateful citizens. Watchtowers that had never been unmanned during the entire siege stood empty as their occupants joined the revelry below. Even the most disciplined soldiers reasoned that with the Greeks gone and their ships vanished beyond the horizon, one night of celebration could surely cause no harm. The wine flowed so freely that streams of it ran in the gutters, and the air grew thick with the smoke of roasting meat as families brought out stores they had hoarded throughout the long siege. Old men who had fought in wars decades past shared stories with young warriors who had earned their first scars in this conflict. Women who had spent years weaving in darkened rooms to avoid Greek arrows now danced openly in the moonlight. The very walls that had protected Troy for 10 years now seemed like prison barriers finally torn down, and the people celebrated not just survival, but freedom. Hidden within the belly of the wooden horse, the elite Greek warriors endured the longest day of their lives. Odysseus had chosen each man not just for their fighting prowess, but for their ability to remain absolutely still and silent for hours on end. The cramped space forced them into uncomfortable positions, their muscles cramping and their throats parched, but discipline born of years of warfare kept them motionless. Through small gaps in the wooden construction, They could hear the celebrations outside, the very people they intended to kill laughing and singing just feet away from their hiding place. Menelaus gripped his sword handle so tightly that his knuckles turned white, thinking of Helen somewhere in the city, perhaps even now looking out at the horse that would restore her to him. Neoptolemus, young son of the great Achilles, felt his father's spirit urging him toward the vengeance that had driven the Greeks across the sea. As the hours passed and the sounds of celebration gradually died away, replaced by the snores of drunken sleep, the warriors knew their moment was approaching. Sinon had done his work perfectly, convincing the Trojans to bring their own destruction within their walls. When the city finally fell silent, except for the occasional call of a night bird or the distant sound of waves against the shore, Odysseus gave the signal that would end the war. One by one, the warriors descended from their wooden prison on ropes that had been carefully prepared for this moment. Their feet touched Trojan soil for the first time in 10 years, not as invaders storming the beaches, but as infiltrators moving through the heart of their enemy's stronghold. The irony was not lost on any of them that Troy's impregnable walls, which had defied a decade of siege, now protected the very men who would destroy the city. Moving like shadows through Troy's sleeping streets, they moved toward the gates that would admit their waiting army. And Troy's long agony rushed toward its inevitable conclusion in fire and blood, as those massive gates swung open with a grinding creak that seemed to echo through the sleeping city. Sinon lit a massive signal fire on Troy's towering walls. The beacon blazed like a second sun against the darkness, its flames reaching hungrily toward the star-filled sky. Visible far out to sea where the Greek fleet had been hiding in patient silence behind the rocky shores of nearby Tenedos Island. With surprising speed that spoke of careful preparation and desperate anticipation, the ships that had seemed to abandon the siege after 10 long years returned like hunting wolves, their black hulls cutting through the moonlit waters, laden with soldiers eager for the final assault that would either crown their decade of suffering with victory or see them all die in the attempt. Throughout the sleeping city, where citizens still lay in beds heavy with wine and celebration, the Greeks who had hidden in the horse's wooden belly began their deadly work with the precision of men who had rehearsed this moment in their minds countless times. Some, led by Neoptolemus, the fierce young son of dead Achilles, moved like shadows toward the royal palace where King Priam slept, unaware that his kingdom's final hour had arrived. Others targeted the barracks where what remained of Troy's once mighty fighting force lay in drunken slumber, their weapons hanging unused on the walls, their guards collapsed at their posts from too much celebration wine. Odysseus and Menelaus, driven by personal vengeance and the memory of 10 years of loss, made for the house of Deiphobus, Paris's brother who had claimed Helen as his bride after Paris fell to a poisoned arrow, expecting to find there the woman whose face had launched 1,000 ships and whose abduction had cost so many lives. By the time the first Trojan citizens awoke to the sounds of combat echoing through their familiar streets, Greek soldiers were already pouring through the open gates like a flood of bronze and iron, spreading throughout the city with the methodical efficiency of men who had planned this moment for years. What followed was not a battle in any honorable sense, but a massacre that would stain the Greek victory with blood and sacrilege. The Trojans, caught completely by surprise and still half drunk from their premature celebration of what they believed was their deliverance, had no chance to organize an effective defense or even to understand what was happening to them. The Greeks, hardened by 10 years of siege warfare, scarred by the deaths of beloved comrades like Achilles and Ajax, and burning with accumulated rage at their long suffering, showed little mercy to the people who had defied them for so long. Houses were set ablaze, initially to provide light for their nighttime attack, but soon as a deliberate tactic to drive out hiding Trojans and create the kind of chaos that would prevent any organized resistance from forming. The flames spread quickly from building to building, aided by a strong wind that seemed to be sent by the gods themselves, perhaps Hera and Athena completing their long, delayed vengeance against the city they had hated since Paris's fateful judgment on Mount Ida. The fire roared through Troy's streets like a living thing, consuming not just buildings, but the accumulated treasures and memories of centuries. turning the wealthy city into a furnace that lit the night sky for miles around. King Priam, awakened by the sounds of slaughter and the smell of smoke, donned his armor for the first time in years, the bronze plates hanging loose on his aged frame. Though far too old to fight effectively, and knowing that death awaited him, he was determined to die as a king should, with sword in hand rather than cowering in his palace like a frightened child. His wife Hecuba, tears streaming down her face, begged him to seek sanctuary at Zeus's altar, where even the most bloodthirsty Greek might hesitate to strike down an old man clinging to the sacred symbols of the king of gods. But Priam replied with the dignity that had made him beloved by his people. "I have lived too long already to see my city burn and my sons die before me. Let me at least die with honor." His end came not in honorable combat, but in sacrilege that would haunt the Greeks for years to come. Neoptolemus, proving himself more savage even than his legendary father Achilles, pursued the aged king through the burning palace to the very altar of Zeus, where Priam had finally sought the sanctuary his wife had urged. There, as the old king clutched the sacred symbols of the god with trembling hands, the young warrior cut him down without hesitation or respect for the holy place, committing an act of impiety for which the gods would later demand terrible payment. Throughout the burning city, similar scenes of brutality unfolded as the Greeks' long, suppressed rage finally found its outlet. Ajax the Lesser found Cassandra, the prophetic daughter of Priam, who had foreseen this very destruction, clinging to the statue of Athena and seeking sanctuary in the goddess's temple. Unmoved by the sacred location or the young woman's desperate pleas, he violated her beneath the very eyes of Athena's statue, an act of desecration that filled the goddess with such outrage that she marked Ajax for destruction, ensuring that his voyage home would end in shipwreck and death. In the house of Deiphobus, Paris's brother, who had married Helen after Paris's death, Menelaus finally confronted the woman who had been the cause, or at least the catalyst, of the entire war. Some stories say Helen had already betrayed her Trojan husband, signaling to the Greeks with lamps placed strategically in the windows, her beauty masking a calculating mind that always chose the winning side. Others suggest she was as surprised as any Trojan by the night attack, awakening to find her world dissolving into fire and blood around her. Menelaus burst into their bedchamber with his sword raised, intending to kill both his wife and her new husband, to end once and for all the pain that had consumed his life for 10 long years. Deiphobus died quickly, cut down before he could even reach for a weapon, but when Menelaus finally stood face to face with Helen, after so many years of war and longing, something unexpected happened. Whether it was her legendary beauty, unchanged by the years, and made even more striking by her fear, her skillful pleading that reminded him of happier times, or some remnant of the love he had once felt for her, Menelaus found he could not strike the fatal blow. Instead, he dragged her roughly toward the ships, declaring she would face judgment back in Sparta, though whether that judgment would be death or forgiveness remained to be seen. As dawn broke over Troy, painting the smoke-filled sky the color of blood, the destruction was nearly complete, and the greatest city of Asia lay in ruins. As the flames consumed the last standing towers of Troy, Queen Hecuba wandered through the devastation like a living ghost, her mind shattered by the magnitude of her losses. She had witnessed the death of her husband Priam at the altar, seen her son Hector's body dragged around the city walls, and watched as her remaining children were either slaughtered or claimed as slaves by the victorious Greeks. In some versions of the tale, the gods took pity on her overwhelming grief and transformed her into a howling dog, giving eternal voice to the anguish that no human words could express. This transformation, whether literal or metaphorical, captured the complete dehumanization that war brings to its victims. The fall of Troy reached its completion as the morning sun climbed higher into the smoke-filled sky, casting an eerie red glow over the destruction. Along the shore, the Greeks methodically gathered their plunder and captives, organizing the spoils of 10 years of warfare. Golden treasures that had adorned Trojan temples were loaded into ships alongside precious fabrics, bronze weapons, and works of art that represented centuries of Trojan craftsmanship. The human cargo was perhaps more valuable still, as skilled artisans, beautiful women, and strong young men would fetch high prices in slave markets across the Greek world. Behind them, the great city continued to burn, sending a massive column of black smoke spiraling into the heavens like a funeral pyre for an entire civilization. This smoke could be seen for miles in every direction, a stark announcement to the world that one of the greatest cities of the Bronze Age had fallen. Before departing, the Greek leaders performed the necessary funeral rites for their own fallen warriors, honoring those who had died in the final assault. They also made careful offerings to the gods, some in gratitude for their victory, others in desperate appeasement for the many impieties committed during the brutal sack of the city. The Greeks knew they had crossed lines that should never be crossed, violating sacred spaces and showing no mercy to suppliants who sought protection at altars. Agamemnon made a fateful choice in claiming the prophetess Cassandra as his personal prize, not knowing that this decision would eventually lead to his own violent death at the hands of his wife Clytemnestra. Meanwhile, Ajax the Lesser had gravely offended the goddess Athena through his brutal treatment of Cassandra at her temple, dragging the priestess from the sacred statue where she had sought sanctuary. When called upon to make proper sacrifices to appease the goddess, Ajax arrogantly refused, boasting that he had triumphed despite the gods, rather than because of their favor. This act of supreme hubris would seal his doom, as Athena would ensure that his journey home became a nightmare of storms and shipwreck. After 10 long years of siege, battle, and suffering, the Trojan War had finally reached its conclusion. The Greeks had achieved their stated objective of recovering Helen and punishing Troy for Paris's transgression. But the victory had come at a terrible cost that few had anticipated when they first sailed from Aulis. Thousands upon thousands of Greek warriors lay buried in the foreign soil of the Trojan plain, their bones bleaching under the Asian sun far from their native lands. Those who survived were fundamentally changed by their experiences, hardened by years of warfare, and haunted by the atrocities they had both witnessed and committed. The idealistic young men who had eagerly joined the expedition for glory and adventure had been replaced by grim veterans who had seen too much death and destruction. For many of these survivors, the true hardships were only just beginning, as the gods had prepared punishments that would make their homeward journeys as perilous as the war itself. As the Greek fleet finally departed from the smoking ruins of Troy, their ships heavy with plunder and captives, the commanders could not foresee the disasters that awaited them on the wine, dark sea. The gods, offended by the Greeks' conduct during the sack, would send terrible storms to scatter the fleet across the Mediterranean. Some ships would be dashed against rocky shores, their crews swallowed by the hungry waves, while others would be blown far off course to strange lands where new adventures and dangers awaited. Of all the heroes who had set out for Troy with such high hopes a decade earlier, remarkably few would enjoy peaceful homecomings and tranquil ends to their days. The destruction of Troy marked not just the end of a war, but the end of an entire age, the twilight of the heroic era when gods regularly intervened in human affairs and mighty warriors performed deeds worthy of eternal song. The bards and storytellers would preserve these tales for countless generations, ensuring that the names of Hector and Achilles, Odysseus and Agamemnon would echo through the centuries long after their bones had turned to dust. And what of Troy itself, the mighty city that had stood proud and unconquered for so many centuries? Though its walls were leveled, its towers toppled, and its people scattered to the winds, Troy achieved a kind of immortality that its builders could never have imagined. In the words of poets and the memories of storytellers, the city would live forever, serving as both inspiration and warning to future generations about the terrible consequences of pride, passion, and divine displeasure.